Welcome to Hub History, where we go far beyond the Freedom Trail to share our favorite stories from the history of Boston, the hub of the universe. This is episode 294, The Rise and Fall of Black Boston's First Hospital. Hi, I'm Jake. This week I'm talking about Plymouth Hospital, the South End institution that became the first training school for black nurses in segregated Boston. I usually like to say that I don't need to do anything special for Black History Month because I talk about Black history when it's not February too. But I just look back at the past year and I realized that I haven't released an episode that's primarily about black people since last February, when I profiled 2 black restaurateurs. This time, we're going to talk about a different type of entrepreneur. Dr. Cornelius Nathanial Garland moved to Boston from the Deep South to seek opportunity. But while he did find opportunity in the hub, he also found a deeply segregated medical establishment. To fight back against this system and to provide opportunities for Black Bostonians in medicine, he founded a hospital and nursing school. Within just a few years, however, the most radical civil rights leader in Boston would accuse Garland of reinforcing the very same system of segregated medicine that he fought against. But before we talk about Dr. Garland and Plymouth Hospital, I just want to pause and thank everyone who sponsors us on Patreon. I'm flattered that you like the show enough to use your actual hard-earned U.S. American currency to help me make it. Each episode of Hub History takes a pretty significant investment of time between thinking up a topic, tracking down sources, and then writing a script, recording it, and editing the result. I'm happy to put in the time, but it does also take money. Our sponsors help us keep up with the cost of web hosting and security, online audio processing tools, research databases, AI tools, and our podcast media host. And we appreciate all of you. Listeners like Diagonalization, our latest Patreon sponsor, make it all possible by contributing as little as $2 a month, or as much as $20 a month like Diagonalization did. And again, we're grateful for all of you. If you're not yet supporting the show and you'd like to start, it's easy. Just go to patreon.com/hubhistory or visit hubhistory.com and click on the Support Us link. And thanks again to all our new and returning sponsors. Now it's time for this week's main topic. 116 years ago, on February 26, 1908, the Boston Globe announced the opening of a new South End institution. Colored Nurses School, new institution at 12 East Springfield Street established through efforts of Dr. C. N. Garland. The Plymouth Hospital and Nurse Training School, the first institution of its kind to be conducted by colored people in this city, opened yesterday afternoon at 12 East Springfield Street. Its establishment is due to the efforts of Dr. Cornelius N. Garland. Today, the South End is one of the most expensive and exclusive neighborhoods in Boston, full of trendy restaurants and boutiques, but also home to some of the greatest wealth disparity in the city. Its quiet streets are lined with trees and brownstones, many of which are multi-million-dollar condos now. It wasn't always like that, though. As recently as the 1990s, it was a transitional neighborhood at best, and a century ago, it was very different. In a 2014 article in the Journal of the BU School of Medicine Historical Society, Allison Barnett describes the neighborhood as it would have existed when Plymouth Hospital opened. East Springfield Street is a tree-lined block between Washington Street and Harrison Ave, where it meets Boston City Hospital. Plymouth Hospital was closer to Washington Street. The majority of property owners on East Springfield Street were Irish, with some Eastern European Jews, and the South End as a whole was a mix of Irish, Canadian, Syrian, Lebanese, Greek, German, and Eastern European Jewish immigrants. A large lodging house district with many charities and settlement houses. Garland may have chosen the location because the L, an elevated train that started running down Washington Street in 1901, made for easy access. According to a 2012 article in the Bay State Banner, there were about 20 black doctors in Boston when Garland arrived here. Many of them were graduates of Harvard Medical School, and most of their practices were concentrated in the South End. By 1908, the black population of the South End and Lower Roxbury was growing fast, as the great migration of black families from the Deep South to the Northeast and the Rust Belt was just getting started. Black-owned medical practices were popping up throughout the neighborhood, some of which were also led by doctors who trained at the College of Physicians and Surgeons on nearby Shawmut Ave. On July 30th, 1909, the Nashville Globe, so not our local Boston Globe, reported on the meeting of the National Medical Association, which was the black answer to the segregated American Medical Association. Under a headline proclaiming Boston to be the Mecca for Negro doctors, the paper gave an extensive overview of Boston's importance to medical history and a guide to the historic sites that visiting doctors could take in. Along with the travel guide, the paper gave this overview of the conference itself, which was to be hosted in part by Garland at his Plymouth Hospital. Arrangements are being made for operations in clinics in well-equipped hospitals, among which are the Massachusetts General Hospital, the oldest of all, the Boston City Hospital, where, after the clinics, luncheon will be served complimentary to the visiting doctors, the Plymouth Hospital, the Blossom Street Children's Hospital, and the Boston Dispensary and the St. Monica's Consumptive Hospital. The scientific exhibits, the clinical exhibits, and the practical clinical demonstrations will prove sufficient scientific entertainment to well repay attendance. Harvard Medical School and Tufts Medical School, with their well-equipped pathological laboratories, will be thrown open to the profession for inspection. At that same conference, Garland was elected as secretary of the National Medical Association, as reported in our own local Boston Globe on August 27th. The surgical section of the National Association held its meeting in the morning, Dr. A.M. Curtis of Washington presiding. Dr. George C. Hall of the Provident Hospital of Chicago and Dr. Willis E. Sturrs of Decatur, Alabama were elected as members of the executive committee of the National Medical Association for the surgical section. Dr. C. N. Garland of Boston was elected secretary. A surgical clinic was held at the Plymouth Hospital, 12 East Springfield Street. Now, Boston may have been a mecca for black doctors, but the Nashville Globe was grading on a curve. At the time, the South End was full of black medical practices, now joined by a hospital and nursing school. However, these institutions existed for a reason, with Allison Barnett writing, while other small hospitals that began in the South End, Children's Hospital, New England Deaconess, and the Free Hospital for Women, may have benefited from their proximity to city, Plymouth Hospital could not. In 1908, Boston City Hospital was the city's main teaching hospital, where both nurses and physicians learned their trades. In her biography of William Monroe Trotter titled Black Radical, past podcast guest Carrie Greenidge describes why aspiring nurses in the neighborhoods surrounding the hospital couldn't train there. Unlike the New England Hospital for Women and Children, however, Boston City Hospital's nurse training school was segregated, despite early protestations that such segregation did not exist. Boston City's administrators and trustees insisted that colored applicants were only prevented from training in their facilities due to the objections of white students and the need to maintain order. And so by the 1920s, Boston City Hospital had the distinction of being located in an increasingly black area of the city, where the only black people in the hospital were either cleaning staff or patients. Unlike in the South, this segregation in Boston was enforced more by custom than by legislation, making it an attractive destination for internal migrants, at least on paper. At first, I couldn't find out much about Cornelius N. Garland's early life. According to his obituary in the Journal of the National Medical Association, Garland was born in Alabama. Then he moved to Raleigh, North Carolina for medical school. Luckily, I stumbled across a fantastic profile for WBUR written by Lisa Gordon, who interviewed Garland's granddaughter shortly before her death in early 2023. Granddaughter Joan Reppert said that Cornelius was the youngest of 12 Garland children. His father was a coffin maker and a carpenter, and the family moved around a lot while Cornelius was young. With financial help from a white family that he worked for, Cornelius Garland was able to attend college at Livingstone College in Salisbury, North Carolina. After completing his studies there, he went on to Shaw University in Raleigh for medical school. According to a brief profile in a 1920 issue of the NAACP's magazine The Crisis, Dr. Garland studied at Livingstone College, received the degree of Doctor of Medicine from Shaw University in 1901, and went to England for a postgraduate course in a London hospital. 2 years later, in Boston, Massachusetts, he began the practice of his profession, and in 1908 he purchased a dwelling, which he converted into a small hospital. In 1906, Garland stood for election to the Boston City Council for Ward 10, but he didn't win. Soon after, he found another form of public service in Plymouth Hospital. In her chapter about the hospital, Carrie Greenidge notes, "When Cornelius E. Garland opened the Plymouth Hospital and Nurse Training School at the corner of East Springfield Street in 1908, the steady influx of black and brown migrants from the South and the Caribbean was already a crashing wave that transformed the granite-based walk-ups and brick sidewalks into the famous Negro District of the 1920s. The 3-story brownstone at number 12, surrounded by over 1,000 square feet of lawn and pavement, had been a private home. But by the time Garland admitted Plymouth's first patients in late 1908, the oak floors and pocket doors that were once bedrooms and parlors held adjustable hospital beds and glass medicine bottles. Plymouth Hospital and Nurse Training School was Greater Boston's first, and for nearly 20 years the only, black-owned medical facility, with 17 patient beds and a steady rotation of talented doctors from around the world. Except for the Boston College of Physicians and Surgeons on Shawmut Avenue, however, racial discrimination prevented most black doctors and nurses from internships at local hospitals, or appointments on the medical staff of Massachusetts General Hospital or Boston Lying In. The Plymouth Hospital and Nurse Training School, then, filled a demand within the South End that went unmet by Boston City Hospital, the main facility for the city's poor and working class since its opening in 1864. So Plymouth Hospital was able to fill a demand that went unmet by City Hospital, training black nurses while also providing free and subsidized care to the South End community. Dr. Garland could provide these free and discounted services through a community partnership that replaced the revenue that full-price customers would have brought in. This partnership was described in the February 26, 1908 edition of the Boston Globe in the article about the hospital's opening. In addition to several wards, there is a nurse's ward, an outpatient's ward, an operating room, an office, and a dining room. The wards are named after the church organizations which contributed toward their furnishings, and will continue to maintain them. The wards are to be known as Taborian, Love and Charity, Columbus Ave AME Zion Church, Emma Spiller, Mount Hebron, and Charles Street AME Church. As you can tell from those names, each patient ward was supported by a South End church, and they all held fundraisers to ensure that their patients would have all the medical supplies they'd need, comfortable accommodations, and appropriate furnishings. For example, the May 14th edition of the Globe in that same year included notice of one of the fundraisers. In aid of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church Ward in the Plymouth Hospital, West Concord Street, a concert was held last evening in the Columbus Ave AME Zion Church under the direction of Leroy J. Johnson. Along with cash, the community supported Plymouth Hospital with in-kind donations, as reported also in the Boston Globe on March 31, 1909. Instead of a baby shower or a wedding shower, the hospital held a different kind of shower. The nurses of the Plymouth Hospital and Nurse Training School, 12 East Springfield Street, had a linen shower at the hospital yesterday afternoon and evening. The hospital was visited by a large number of people who brought with them presents of linen. That's one way to make sure you have clean sheets. On November 1st, 1909, the Globe reported on a meeting of the Plymouth Linda Hand Society, another community organization that was founded to support the hospital. A public meeting, which crowded the Columbus Ave African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, was held yesterday afternoon in the interest of the Plymouth Hospital on East Springfield Street, under the auspices of the Plymouth Linda Hand Club. In her book, Carrie Greenidge notes that one of the founders of that Linda Hand Society was William Monroe Trotter, which you'll find as funny as I do in a few minutes. The Boston Globe reported on the first annual report of the Plymouth Hospital on September 20th, 1909, showing how the contributions of the Linda Hand Club, churches, and individual community members supported the work of the hospital. The report shows that generous donations in regard to equipment have been given to the institution by colored people and by their churches and various associations. In the nurse training school, 22 students have nearly completed the first year's course. The hospital has treated free of charge 116 patients. There have been 52 cases in free district work cared for by the nurses in the school. The expenses were $2,093.30. Cash received $1,323. Even before graduating its first nurses, Plymouth Hospital was making a difference in the community, having treated 116 people who might not have received care otherwise. Finally, after a 2-year course of study, the hospital was ready to send its graduates into the world to care for their communities. On July 1, 1910, the Boston Globe reported on the graduation ceremony for the first 7 nurses to complete the training program at Plymouth. The Plymouth Hospital and Training School for Nurses held its first graduating exercises yesterday afternoon in Lorimer Hall, Tremont Temple Building. Diplomas being presented to 7 graduates by Counselor Thomas F. Kinney, acting for Mayor Fitzgerald, before an audience that filled the hall. The Plymouth Hospital and Training School is on West Springfield Street and is an institution founded and supported by colored people in Boston and vicinity. Since it's been in operation, it has done splendid work among the people it was founded to aid. The exercises were opened at 3:30 with a selection from an orchestra. The invocation was by Reverend Dr. George A. McGuire of St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church in Cambridge, who also presented the class with emblems and pronounced the benediction. The commencement address on The Real Mission of the Truly Trained Nurse was delivered by Reverend G. F. Durgan of the Bromfield Street Methodist Episcopal Church. Dr. Garland himself had the last word at the first graduation. I believe the Plymouth Hospital and Training School has put out a class of nurses that will be a benefit to the community. The institution exists in order to meet a long-felt need. Our colored women are scarcely admitted generally in the hospitals of this state. This condition should not properly exist, and there is left nothing else for us than to have a training school where young colored women can become trained nurses, as there is a demand today for skilled colored nurses. Each year, the hospital grew, taking in more nursing students and providing needed medical and surgical care to a black community that was excluded from many other hospitals. In her article, Allison Barnett wrote, "From 1909 to 1914, 135 male and 457 female patients were admitted. As Dr. Garland was a surgeon, surgical patients were the majority, and there were many appendectomies, hysterectomies, and tonsillectomies. 600 people, including children, were seen in the free outpatient department, and 200 cared for by nurses doing free district work, or home visits into the homes of the poor and needy. So at the height of its enrollment, the Plymouth Hospital offered both free care for a predominantly black community and the only opportunity for black nurses to get professional training in Boston. So how could anybody have a problem with that? Well, for that, we need to reintroduce William Monroe Trotter. Monroe Trotter was born into black intellectual royalty. His father, James, was one of the first black officers in the U.S. Army, serving with distinction in the 55th Massachusetts Infantry. Monroe grew up in Hyde Park, where he was the valedictorian of Hyde Park High, then attended Harvard, graduating magna cum laude, and finishing his master's in 1895. He made a name for himself by confronting Booker T. Washington and demanding more radical action to further civil rights than Washington advocated for. He was an early ally of W.E.B. Du Bois, co-founding the Niagara Movement with him and contributing to the early development of the NAACP. By the time Dr. Garland opened his hospital, Trotter was at the helm of the influential Boston Guardian newspaper, and he had a reputation as one of the most radical black voices in the country. He also had a reputation as someone whose uncompromising nature made him almost impossible to work with. We have 2 past episodes about Trotter, which I'll link to in the show notes this week. Trotter had no patience for Booker T. Washington and assimilationist policies, which he saw as maintaining segregated institutions while promoting gradual economic uplift. When Monroe Trotter looked at an all-black hospital in the South End, all he saw was one more segregated institution keeping black people down. Trotter took to the pages of The Guardian in 1908 to oppose the new hospital, dividing opinion among his readers. In Black Radical, Cary Greenidge notes, "Many new Negroes, including the usually supportive Negro world, criticized Trotter's efforts. The Guardian, they claimed, was out of touch with the needs of the new Negro. Boston Quixotes and famous tilt against segregation in form of a proposed hospital by race doctor," screamed the New York Age headline. In an oral history interview given in 1976, a nurse who trained under Garland 50 years earlier shared her perspective on Trotter's campaign against Plymouth Hospital. Trotter and them fought against the thing all the time because he felt it was segregation for a black person to start anything in Boston. And he couldn't see that Irish, Italians, Jews were starting things. But he fought Dr. Garland like anything, because he was the one that threatened Booker T. Washington when he came here. Despite this growing perception of Trotter, even within the black community as an obstructionist, other community leaders saw the necessity of Plymouth Hospital, with Allison Barnett quoting Melnia Cass as saying, "Garland wanted a place where colored people could go and freely train. We needed that hospital. If we had put our forces behind it, white and black would have gone there. It was a monument to black people's ingenuity." Cary Greenidge continues, "But Trotter's Citizens Committee, which included most of the black physicians and nurses whose early careers were stymied by racial discrimination in the city, did not see Plymouth Hospital as the problem. After all, many of them worked at Plymouth Hospital over the years, serving the patients that Boston City ignored, and teaching the students that few facilities agreed to train. Rather, many on the Citizens Committee argued, segregation and persistent health inequity in one of the premier medical centers in the country represented all of the institutionalized inequities caused by racial segregation. Black patients needed a hospital that met their needs, but in providing them, Plymouth reified the very discriminations that made it necessary in the first place. This was not the fault of Garland or his staff, but of segregation itself. Lack of quality equipment and limited funds meant that black patients suffered, not because Garland and his staff didn't care, but because the city's other hospitals received resources that Plymouth did not. For instance, when one patient suffered a gruesome arm injury, Garland lacked the staff to properly restrain the woman as her broken bones split through the skin and nearly caused toxic shock. Garland and his nurses managed to set the break, but without the equipment of Boston City or Massachusetts General, the set led to further injury. The woman was forced to get additional treatment at Boston City Hospital, where they managed to save her arm, but not without significant nerve damage. She sued Dr. Garland for $600, which the Massachusetts Superior Court upheld, since Garland could only plead that outdated equipment and lack of funds to replace it resulted in this mistake. In 1928, Garland made an offer to buy another, larger hospital facility in Roxbury. He needed a more modern operating room to meet state regulations and stay in business. According to that same 1976 oral history by a nurse who trained at Plymouth in the mid-20s, the state changed the standards for nursing education in about 1924, and Garland's hospital was in danger of losing its accreditation. The year that I went in there, they had told him that he had to get it enlarged and get more equipment and pick up the standards more because we wouldn't be able to take the state board. That warning came true in 1928 when Plymouth Hospital was forced to close. Monroe Trotter took to the pages of The Guardian yet again to try to block Garland's purchase of a Roxbury hospital, while at the same time pressuring Boston City Hospital to begin accepting black nursing students. Cary Greenidge writes, "A writer accused anti-hospital agitators like Trotter of objecting to Garland's plan only after the doctor tried to purchase a larger facility in Roxbury to accommodate the increase in patients and the demand for a modern operating room. In the end, Trotter's effort was successful, and Dr. Garland was forced to close Plymouth Hospital when he couldn't expand into a modern OR. Brookline historian and past podcast guest Ken Liss describes how the Garland family moved from a brownstone that they purchased in 1908 to nearby Brookline after the hospital closed. Cornelius and Margaret Garland lived on West Canton Street in the South End, on the edge of the Back Bay and a 15-minute walk from Plymouth Hospital. In December 1928, after the closing of the hospital, they purchased a newly built home at 173 Mason Terrace in Brookline. The deed was in Margaret's name. Garland continued to practice medicine in Boston out of an office at the West Canton Street brownstone, while renting the rest of the former home to tenants. Under pressure from William Monroe Trotter and others, BCH started admitting black nurse trainees in 1929 and black medical interns in 1932. The first black doctor joined the staff of Boston City Hospital in 1949. Dr. Garland continued to practice medicine, and he served as a civil defense official in Brookline during World War II. Margaret died in 1945, and on June 28, 1952, William Monroe Trotter's old newspaper, the Boston Guardian, ran an obituary for Dr. Cornelius N. Garland at the top of the front page. He was 76 years old when he passed. The funeral was held at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and Dr. Garland is buried at Forest Hills Cemetery. To learn more about Dr. Cornelius Garland and Plymouth Hospital, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/294. I'll have links to all the sources I quoted from this week. There will be a ton of contemporaneous Globe articles, as well as articles from other papers, including The Guardian and the Nashville Globe. Along with newspaper articles, we'll also provide links to Garland's obituary in the Journal of the National Medical Association, Allison Barnett's profile in the Journal of the BU School of Medicine Historical Society, and an oral history with Lucille Allen, who studied under Garland. I'll also include a link where you can support your local bookstore and the show by purchasing Carrie Greenidge's biography of William Monroe Trotter. This week, you should also be sure to read Lisa Gordon's reporting about the Plymouth Hospital for WBUR, which she was inspired to write after realizing that her apartment was part of Dr. Garland's old hospital, and which culminated with her interviewing Garland's granddaughter, Joan. It's a really great article, and it tipped me off to this show topic. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email podcast@hubhistory.com. We are Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, though I haven't been very active on social media lately. The easiest way to get in touch with me is to go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please consider writing us a brief review. If you do, drop me a line, and I'll send you a Hub History sticker as a token of appreciation. That's all for now. Stay safe out there, listeners. I'm going to send you out this week with this blooper, where I kind of accidentally made a rap out of an early 20th century newspaper article. In aid of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church ward in the Plymouth Hospital, In aid of the African Methodist Episcopal Church In aid of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church ward in the Plymouth Hospital, West Concord Street, in the aid of the African Methodist Episcopal Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. In the aid of the African Methodist Episcopals. In the aid of the African Methodists. Yeah, it's almost there.